South Africa avoided, and I quote now, a massacre of its soldiers in Sudan when it refused to arrest Sudanese President Omar Al-Bashir back in 2015. That's according to former Defense Minister Nosiviwe Mapisa-Nqakula, who made this confession to Newzroom Afrika yesterday when questioned about the country's defiance of the International Criminal Court's arrest warrant issued against Al-Bashir at the time. Here's what the former defense minister said about that incident.
It is a controversial issue which you are raising, but I also want to provide clarity at a time when that particular decision was taken. You know, Goli, you'll recall that we hosted the AU at a time during that time here in South Africa. At a time when we had, for instance, members of the South African National Defence Force deployed to Sudan. And the moment there was a warrant of arrest, not a warrant of arrest, a declaration here by the courts that President Al-Bashir should be arrested. Do you know that, in fact, on that day, the Sudanese soldiers actually encircled and our bases where our people were located? Do you know that our people could have been easily massacred? Yes, they are soldiers. Yes, they were in Sudan. But do you know what the implications of his arrest at the time in South Africa? What could have happened to soldiers who were deployed in Sudan at the time? I don't think anyone has ever you've given yourselves the time to understand, have an appreciation of why it ended up the way it did. That at the time South Africa had men and women who were part of a peacekeeping force in Sudan. And that if President Al-Bashir had been arrested in South Africa at the time, there could have been a serious battles which would have impacted negatively. We would have lost, we would have suffered serious casualties. I'm just making this statement because sometimes I get a sense that there's information I think we as government may have failed to put out to South Africans so that South Africans are aware of some of the decisions. That was a decision of a court, you are correct. And of course, you may not interfere with decisions of the court, but I also want to tell you about the political implications of that decision and what could have easily happened at the time.
Well, let's continue this conversation, and our government could potentially be faced with the same dilemma in August if Russia's President Vladimir Putin attends the BRICS summit, which will be hosted on South African soil. An arrest warrant has been issued against Putin for what the ICC says are crimes against humanity committed in Ukraine. Let's speak now to Advocate Pikkie Greeff. He is the leader of the South African National Defence Union and joins us now to talk to us about these revelations. Advocate, good morning to you and thank you for your time. Let me ask for your reaction first. 8 years after that incident, what do you make of the former Defence Minister's revelations?
I think it's astounding because 8 years ago, the same Defence Minister were denying those very reports, which today she says the decision was based on to let Bashir go. It was put to her by a very prominent journalist, Erica Gibson, at the time the story broke, that the Sudanese forces may have threatened the South African forces in order to stop the arrest, and she flatly denied it. The Department of Defense flatly denied it, and so did the Zuma presidency. Astoundingly, 8 years later, they walk back that denial and now use that as the excuse. And quite ironically, in doing the walk back, she's actually confessing to crimes having been committed by top South African officials, including possibly cabinet ministers and the former president himself.
When you say what she is admitting to is potentially crimes that could have been committed by high-ranking South African officials, what kind of crimes are we talking about?
Well, firstly, on the Sunday when Al-Bashir was under South African escort, by the way, of the Security Service of South Africa, allowed to flee South Africa from the Waterkloof Air Force Base, there was already a court order in place for 20 hours at that stage, which instructed amongst others, the Minister of Defense as a respondent, to not allow Al-Bashir to leave South Africa and to prohibit all ports of entry and exit to allow him to go through those. That would include the Waterkloof Air Force Base. And so what she's now saying is that the South African government and some of its ministries and officials participated in actively undermining that court order. In other words, committing the crime of contempt of court. In the second place, this court order was in place pending the final decision by the court of whether the arrest warrant should indeed be executed. And obviously, what they were doing is these officials were conspiring in order to prevent the execution of a possible warrant or a possible execution of a warrant of arrest. And that, of course, is obstruction of justice.
Yeah. And so while you have painted the picture that you have just now, what questions then do you think we should be asking of our government, but also importantly, what kind of action could potentially be taken after these revelations?
I think the government should explain to us why the former administration wasn't honest with the public from the start. If it is indeed as serious as the minister, the former Minister of Defense suggests, that our troops were going to be massacred, then that would be a huge diplomatic embarrassment that was hidden from the public. And frankly, it's rather incredulous for the simple reason that it was during an AU summit that this would have occurred. The diplomatic consequences of even making such a threat would have been huge for Sudan. It's highly unlikely. There were reports from the military at that stage that there were certain troop movements, but they very explicitly stated there were no threats, real threat to the South African troops. So, the question the public should be asking is, did they, when they denied it at first, government, were they lying then? Or by telling the story today, are they lying now? That's the first question that should be asked. Either way, of course, both of these scenarios can't be true at the same time. And either way, either one of which is true doesn't really matter, because what matters is she is now, as you've said in the introduction, actually confessed that the government actively worked and aided and abetted Al-Bashir to escape and evade arrest in contravention of a court order and in obstruction of South African justice.
Advocate Greeff, you are a lawyer and you would know what the implications of undermining the law, what that means in practice. And I'm saying this because on the 11th of February 2020, this is now years after this incident occurred, the current leadership of Sudan, they have reportedly agreed to hand over Omar al-Bashir to the ICC in order for him to face serious crimes of genocide and war crimes or crimes against humanity. Now, that is that country saying this against their former leader. What does that say about us and the respect for the rule of law?
I'm afraid, it reflects very, very badly on South Africa as a state and as a state that can be depended upon in keeping to its international agreements and obligations and the rule of law. It's actually embarrassing for South Africa as a state. And really, the South African government should stop dragging its feet now. The state should stop dragging its feet now with this Putin issue as well, because it's very clear that it's quickly going to, has the potential to quickly escalate into another huge diplomatic embarrassment. Either the governing party should go back to its stance that it wants to withdraw from the ICC and from the agreement that it has, the the international agreement that is part of the ICC, or it should take some stance of some nature that they will arrest this person if he comes into South Africa, or any such person. It's not just about the leader of Russia. But to do simply nothing and to think out excuses for previous failures, which are also questionable excuses, that is definitely not the answer. It rather seems to me that the state is rather in a quandary as to what to do, and that in itself doesn't inspire confidence from the public, and it raises all kinds of questions on the decisiveness of the people that lead this country. Yeah,
the question that I cannot not ask you has to do with the minister that leads the Defense Department right now, Thandi Modise. Do you think there is an obligation on her part to address the nation and explain her predecessor's revelations? Because these are very, very explosive revelations.
Yes, I think there is a duty, and I think more than that, there's a right for the public to know what occurred and what was hidden from them, what was kept secret from them, because we have a right to know that as the public. And remember, if such incidents occurred, and I'm referring to the alleged surrounding of our forces by Sudanese military, that would have been captured in military records, because there is a daily situational report that goes from every deployment to the SNDF headquarters, the operational headquarters of the SNDF. And so those documents are available and they're in the archives. And I would not be surprised if someone in some organization in civil society, human rights, civil rights organization in South African society, launches an application or legal proceedings to gain access to that information to have it published. And I think rather than suffer more embarrassment around it, the Department of Defense should come clean and give a full and clear picture of exactly what emerged during that 24-odd hours after the court ordered that President Al-Bashir is not allowed to leave South Africa.
Yeah. Advocate Pikkie Greeff, thank you very much for your time. And, just explaining the intricacies around these revelations. We're hoping that at some point the Defense Ministry is going to come to us and tell us exactly whether or not it is the truth that we have been told by the former Defense Minister. Well,